Hello everyone, my name is Abhishek and welcome back to my channel. Today is day 8 of AWS Zero to Hero series, and in this video we will learn about the scenario based interview questions on the topics that we have learned from day 0 to day 7. That means you will learn what kind of scenario based interview questions you can expect on this topic such as VPC, subnet, security groups, EC2 instances and IAM. This is very interesting and important as well because these days in interviews, people usually are asking scenario based questions rather than asking you what is EC2 instance, what is VPC. People are asking you like, okay, so there is a specific scenario. Interviewers ask you, how do you handle this specific scenario? Or if you run into an issue, how do you solve this specific problem? How do you design an architecture? So let's dedicate this video to that scenario based questions. And in this video, I'll show you 10 scenario based interview questions. I've collected these things from multiple sources and from my personal experience as well. So without wasting any time, let's quickly jump onto the video and see the questions as well as answers. So the first question that I have for you is the interviewer asking you if you have to design a VPC architecture for two-tier application and the application has to be highly available and scalable. How do you design this VPC architecture? So I think if you have watched our previous videos, this is very easy to answer. But let's break down these questions. There are two parts, right? The first question is two-tier application. How do you put that in the VPC? And the second question is to make this application highly available and scalable. So let's talk about the second one first. To make this highly available and scalable, first the availability part, we will solve using multiple availability zones. So we will put the same application in two availability zones, like EC2 instance will be placed in US East 1A and US East 1B or any two availability zones, so that even if one goes down, there is another availability zone that is taking care of the request. Coming about the scalability, it is better to do it with auto scaling groups. So what will happen is, if you are using auto scaling groups, tomorrow if the number of requests go high, auto scaling group can immediately scale your instances and say that, okay, there is no problem, you can handle the load. So availability is solved using availability zones. Scalability is solved by using auto scaling groups. Now, the first part of the question is, how do you put the two-tier architecture application? So two-tier is nothing but, let's say your application handles the front end and the back end, right? So DB will be taken care in the three-tier architecture. But because we haven't discussed about databases, how AWS handles the databases and all, now let's restrict to two-tier architecture. So it's very simple, as we have learned in the previous video as well on day 7. So you can basically create a public subnet and you can create a private subnet. In the public subnet, basically place a load balancer, and in the private subnet, you can just deploy the two-tier based architecture application, right? So let's see if the answer says the same thing. So what does the answer say here? In this scenario, I would design a VPC architecture in the following way. I would create two subnets, public and private. The public subnet would contain the load balancer and be accessible from the internet. Of course, the load balancer should always be accessible from the internet. If not, how will you even access the specific applications? So applications will be accessed through the load balancer. So if load balancer itself is not in the public subnet, and if it cannot be accessed to the internet, then there is no point. And in the private subnet, you would host the application servers. Perfect. And what is the next question? I mean, what is the next part? I would distribute the subnets across multiple availability zones, exactly, for high availability. Additionally, I will use auto scaling groups for application servers. Perfect. I think this is exactly what we discussed, and we were able to answer this scenario based question. Let's move to question number 2. Your organization has a VPC with multiple subnets. Perfect. You want to restrict outbound internet access for resources in one subnet, but allow outbound internet access for resources in another subnet. How would you achieve this? Okay, so this is a very good question because there are multiple ways to answer this, right? So if you know about the concept of security groups, for each instance, you can restrict the outbound access, right? And there are other ways of doing it, but the most efficient way, like let's say somebody is asking you the same question in the interview, you can say multiple scenarios, but at the end of the thing, you can say the best way to do this is simply go to the route tables. Like let's say there is a subnet XYZ. Go to the subnet XYZ identify the route table attached to this subnet, go to the route table and just remove the default route where you have this specific thing 0.0.0.0. That means anywhere, like it says the source is anything that points to the internet gateway. If the public subnet or if the subnet is not pointing to the internet gateway, then there is no way that you can access external world, right? We discussed this in the previous videos as well. Without internet gateway, there is no access to the internet, or there is no person who can access into the VPC from the internet. So internet gateway is the one basically that is handling this gateway. Now, how does a public subnet or load balancer in the public subnet usually have access to the internet? Is using this route gateway, which has connected to the, which has destination as the internet gateway. Internet gateway. Route table has destination as internet gateway. If you just remove that, if you just remove the default route, then there is no way the applications or anything that is available in that subnet can access to the internet, right? So that is exactly what I defined here. To restrict outbound internet access for resources in one subnet, we can modify the route table associated with that subnet. Perfect. In the route table, we can remove the default route that points to the internet gateway. If you remove that, then there is no internet gateway, so there is no traffic that can flow in or out of the subnet. Perfect. So this is how you can do it, and you can also read these answers. Let's say you want to copy these answers or something. Don't worry, I have put the link in the description for the GitHub repo. That is our AWS Zero to Hero GitHub repo. And in that specific repository, you have questions and answers in the Day-8 folder. So just go to that folder or use the link in the description. You can get the questions and answers, both of the things. You can copy them, you can start the repository, whatever you would like to. Let's go to question number 3. You have a VPC with public subnet and private subnet. Okay. Instances in private subnet need access to internet for software updates. Definitely. How would you allow internet access for instances in private subnet? Very good question, right? And I think I have repeated this multiple times. If you have watched day 0 to day 7, you will be easily able to answer this question. So generally, for instances in private subnets, to access any websites or to access anything from the internet, let's say for software updates or to get some information, you need to use NAT gateway. So NAT gateway solves one of the very critical problems. That is, it not only gives you access to connect to the internet and get the things that you require, but the other important thing is, because NAT gateway is located in the public subnet and it uses the concept called network address translation. What does it do? Network address translation. So it will take the instance, the private subnet EC2 instance IP address, and it will translate to the IP address of the NAT gateway. So it will change the private IP address to the public IP address of the NAT gateway, and it will send the request. Let's say the website that you are trying to reach is hacked or compromised. Still, they will not know the IP address or details of your EC2 instance or the application that is deployed in this secure subnet. So you will prevent and you will add more security to your instances. The same thing is added here as well. To allow internet access for the instances in private subnet, we use NAT gateway or a NAT instance. We would place NAT gateway in the public subnet and configure the private subnet route table to send outbound traffic to NAT gateway. Of course, this way instances in private subnet can access internet through NAT gateway. And another advantage is, just I mentioned, the network address translation concept. Very good. Let's move to the next one. Question number 4. You have launched EC2 instances in your VPC and you want them to communicate with each other using private IP addresses. Okay, let's say there are 2 instances, foo and bar. So foo instance want to communicate with bar instance using the private IP address. Okay, what steps would you take to enable this communication? Again, this is a scenario based question, and this is a very simple one. Sometimes, when you see a scenario based question, you might think, okay, this will be complicated, but sometimes the scenarios are very simple as well. In this scenario, the answer is very, very simple. For the instance to connect to another instance, firstly, they have to be in the same VPC. And secondly, the subnet, let's say foo is in one subnet and bar is in another subnet, then at least there has to be some way of communication between the subnets, or both foo and bar instance should be in the same subnet. right? If they are in the same subnet, that means they will have the same CIDR block, or they will have the same subnet IP address range. And if they are in the same subnet IP address range, then they can communicate with each other. Very simple, right? Or there is one more concept that I haven't covered. We will cover in the future. So let's say one subnet is in one VPC and another subnet is in another VPC. In that case, we will use a concept called VPC pairing. So VPC peering is a concept where you will allow one VPC to talk to another VPC through a VPC link. Okay, so we haven't reached to that point. When we reach, we will discuss, but it will be a very simple concept. It's not that difficult. Basically, you will go to the route table and you will attach the endpoint of the other VPC. And similarly, you will do it in the other VPC. Just the route tables will be updated so that one VPC can communicate to the other VPC. We'll discuss this in detail when we move to that point. Question number 5. You want to implement strict network access control for your VPC. How would you achieve this? So this is a very, very important question. And I think if you are giving an interview on AWS where they are very focused on network, where very focused on VPC, then most likely you will face this kind of questions where they will ask you, okay, how do you make your network very secure? So we have learned about these things in much detailed way, right? So we have learned about the topics of security groups, NACLs. We dedicated one full video and we did the practical as well. So to answer this question, you will use NACLs, that is network ACLs. Using network ACLs, you can configure, you can maintain a very fine-grained network access control. So you can say, okay, you can define the rules for your subnets, right? Using NACLs, you can define what do you say? You can define the defense of your AWS network. You can define like, okay, what can go into the subnet, and you can say, okay, allow only specific IP addresses to the subnet. You can deny a specific IP address to enter. You can do this with security groups as well. But like I keep saying, security groups are only meant for the instance level. Whereas if you are using network ACLs, then you can restrict them at the subnet level itself. So NACL adds as an extra level of defense. So this extra level of defense will give you more security. So again, you have the answer here, which is very similar to what I just said. But if you want to put them in the exact lines, then you can take this from here, or you can take from the GitHub repository. Next question. Your organization requires an isolated environment with the VPC for running sensitive workloads. How do you set up the isolated environment? Okay, so this is not a difficult question. Basically, I have added it intentionally. So what the person is asking here is, your organization has a VPC, and even in that VPC, you need a very isolated environment. Okay, so I was just checking how much you understood about the concept of subnets. It's a very simple question. What you will do is, within the VPC, you will create another subnet, and you will keep this subnet very private, and you will not give any internet gateway, any internet access to the subnet. That's it, right? So how do you create an isolated environment within the VPC? Using the subnets. Because what subnet does, subnet in a VPC, let's say VPC is this big circle, so subnet will take a part of this big circle, right? So it will just say that, okay, within the VPC, this is another subnetworking. So if VPC is 10.10.0.0, then for subnet you can define, okay, I just want some out of the 65536 IP address, just give me some 2000 IP address, 3000 IP address, and I will just dedicate this to some internal project or group of applications which want to be in a different subnet, right? So isolation is taken care by subnets concept. So you can use either public subnet or private subnet depending upon your use case, because here they are asking about sensitive workloads and they want to keep it very, very secure. So I would choose a private subnet, and that private subnet I'll keep very isolated, that even there will not be any internet access, there will not be any access to the bastion host or anything. Perfect. Next question. Your application need access to AWS services such as S3 to communicate securely within the VPC. How would you achieve this? So this one I did not cover too much, but when I did the VPC configuration in the last video, when I was doing the day 7, I showed you that there is something called as VPC gateway. or S3 VPC gateway. I just showed you, right? When we were creating the VPC, we used an option called VPC and more. Then in the diagram, you saw something like gateway, VPC gateway. So you can use that same thing. Let's say you want to allow AWS services within the VPC. For example, EC2 instance, want to access something in the something like S3 bucket or DynamoDB. What you can do is you can use VPC endpoints. Sorry, not gateway. You should use something called VPC endpoints. And using the VPC endpoint, you can say, okay, so allow S3 bucket to access within the AWS resources within the VPC can access the S3 bucket using this VPC endpoint. Okay, so don't worry, I did not cover VPC endpoints, I know, but because I was doing this scenario based question, I thought it is good to put this question here so that you will understand that, okay, there is some question like this that Abhishek did not cover in the day 0 to day 7, but we will cover this when we learn about S3 and when we do some practicals, right? Because we haven't learned about S3 bucket, we did not learn about DynamoDB. It will not be fair if I cover the topic of VPC endpoints in the previous topics. Next question. What is the difference between NACL and subnet? So I think I've covered this answer in the previous slides, but still, just to give one last time overview, because NACLs and subnets are very, very useful and DevOps engineers play a very critical role with NACLs and subnets. Just one word answer, subnet acts at the instance level and NACL basically acts at the subnet level, right? So instance level, if you want to do any configuration, go with security groups. And at the subnet level, if you want to define very fine-grained access, you want to block specific things, you want to only allow specific things, then NACLs will be very good. And basically NACLs are considered as stateless and subnets are considered as state resources. We will talk about that, why NACLs is called as stateless and why this is called as state. There is not much difference. Basically, let's say you're using subnet groups. So if an application inside the instance is accessing the internet, so you will open the inbound traffic rules, right? And when it receives the response from the internet, like let's say you are talking to google.com from application inside the EC2 instance, you will open port 80 or some port to talk to google.com, right? And when google.com sends request back to you, in case of subnets, you don't open the outbound traffic, okay? Because subnets are basically stateful, where it understands that, okay, I sent the request and the response is coming for the request. So I will definitely accept this and there is no need to open any outbound traffic rules. Whereas in terms of NACLs, they are stateless. That means even for the same purpose that I've just defined, you have sent the request and google.com is sending the request back to you, response back to you, but still you have to open inbound and outbound traffic for NACLs, right? So this is about stateful and stateless, but okay, I mean, if you know the concept, it's okay even if you don't understand, if you don't remember the word stateful and stateless, but you should understand this concept. And I hope it is very clear when we will use security groups, when we will use NACLs, and the good practice is to use both of them. Like I mentioned in the previous videos and where we did the example as well on day 6. So practically that's how organizations use NACL and security groups. Next question. What is the difference between IAM users, groups, roles, and policies? We discussed this in detail on day 2, where I explained you what is IAM users, what is groups, what is roles and policies. But just to give an overview, this question can be put on a basic level. Let's say you are giving a fresher level interview or you are giving 1 year or 2 years. Then people might ask you, what do you do with IAM? What is IAM user? What is group, roles and policies? So it is better to understand. So IAM user basically is an identity, right? What IAM does, IAM solves the problem of authentication and authorization, where we saw with very basic example of how IAM in AWS operates, what is authentication, what is authorization, with an example of bank. If you haven't watched that, please go and watch the day 2 to understand IAM in a very, very, very simple way. Now, users, IAM users are created for users like us. Like let's say there is a new person that joins your organization and requires access to AWS, then you will create an IAM user for that person and they will be able to access. What will IAM policy do? IAM policy is used to define Okay, so what permissions does this person require on the AWS? That is, policies handle the authorization part. Users or are created, they can just enter the AWS account, but without policies they'll not be able to authorize anything. So in the policies you will say, okay, give them access to EC2 instance, write access, read access, S3 buckets, Kubernetes. Okay, that things you will define in the policies. Then what is groups? Instead of doing these policies for each and every user, you can just create a group called developers, and whenever a new person joins the development team, just create a user for him and just add that user to the development group, so that in future, if you are not using groups, what will happen is, if there are 500 IAM users, all are developers, and all of them request you at once, hey, we want access to one more resource, then you have to sit down and keep adding that specific policy for all the 500 IAM users, right? So you will go and say that, okay, they'll request you, all 500 of us need access to Elastic Kubernetes service, for example. So you will go and add that permission in each of the policy of 500 IAM users. Instead, if you create a group, you can just update the group policy, and if 500 people say that, okay, don't worry, I updated the group policy, so it will reflect in all the 500 users. Finally, what is roles? Basically, these IAM users and all are mostly given to people like us. Any developer or tester or DevOps engineer joins the team, you will create IAM users. Whereas roles, what you would do is, it will be given for the like kind of services. I'll give a very basic example. I think some people did not understand it last time, but let me say that there is an application, Python application that you have defined in the EC2 instance. You have created the Python application and you have deployed the Python application inside the EC2 instance. Now, for some reason, this application needs access to a database in AWS, or needs access to S3 buckets in AWS, or any storage service in AWS. So what you will do is, basically for this EC2 instance, you will attach a role where in the EC2 instance role, you will say, okay, give me read permissions to the database, give me write permissions to the database. So here you are not giving permissions to the users, but you are giving permissions to the services. In such cases, roles are most widely used. Okay, so next is the last question, and this question is basically, you have private subnet in VPC that contains a number of instances. Okay, in a private subnet, there are number of instances that should not have direct internet access. Perfect. However, you still need to be able to securely access these instances for administrative purposes. Sorry. How would you set up a Bastion host to facilitate the access? So here I have given you a hint already that you need to use Bastion host, but there are some interviewers who will confuse you, and they will ask you these scenarios that, okay, I have deployed an application in the private subnet, and now I want to update few things in the application, or I want to deploy few things in that private subnet EC2 instance. How will you basically access it? So we just did this practice exercise in the last video. So people who have followed the day 7 video, they will already know that we will use something called as Bastion host or jump server. So basically, Bastion host or jump server, what they do is, they will be located in the public subnet, and they will have the access to the subnet where the private instance is created, or the application in the private instance is created. And using that Bastion host, you will log into the application in the private subnet, right? So what is this Bastion host exactly doing? So it is providing a path to connect to the instance in the private subnet. Without Bastion, you will never be able to access it. And it will add a lot of security aspects as well, because there is only one single host. And from that one single host, you have access to all the applications in the private subnet. So you can also use it for security purposes. You can configure additional security rules. You can write some scripts and see who is logging into that Bastion host, what are the activities, what are the commands they're executing on that Bastion host, whatnot. You can do a lot of things. So Bastion is a very popular concept used in most of the organizations for the same purpose. And I've added some points here as well, so you can take a look at it. For Windows, we will use RDP. For Linux, we'll use SSH, right? The protocols and all the other aspects, how to create Bastion, how to use Bastion. Theory part is available here. If you want to learn practically, please watch the previous video, that is day 7, where we have configured not just the Bastion, but we have done the entire VPC public private subnet architecture. We used load balancer, and we saw how to access applications inside the private subnet. We used auto scaling, we used availability, all the concepts. So these are the 10 scenario based questions, and these are the most commonly used. So like I told you, I took a lot of effort to get these things from multiple places, multiple sources. I used my personal knowledge to write all of these answers. So if you like the effort and if you think that this was helpful to you, please subscribe to the channel, because very less people have actually subscribed to the channel. The regular viewers, 50% or 55% have subscribed. And previously it used to be 60, now it's 55 only. So I will request you to subscribe to the channel if you find the information useful. And if you know someone who wants to learn AWS or DevOps, please refer our channel to them. Thank you so much for watching the videos. See you all in the next one. Take care. Bye.